In 2023, worldwide, we hit a 60-year low in terms of the volume of wine produced, and that was particularly because of climate change. Hi, my name's Justine Vanden Heuvel. I'm a professor of viticulture in the School of Integrated Plant Science at Cornell University. I really enjoy my position here, particularly working with our incredible students, working closely with the industry, and conducting our research program. What is viticulture? Why is it important? Viticulture is both the science and the practice of growing grapes. So in terms of practices, it encompasses everything that we do in the vineyard: soil management, canopy management, fertilization, control of fungal and bacterial diseases. In terms of the science, it brings in many different fields together. So plant science, soil science, climatology, genetics, fermentation science, all of those are involved in viticulture. It's important because a lot of grapes are grown around the world for table grapes, raisins, juice grapes, and then particularly wine grapes. The term viticulture is often associated with wine, but it also applies to these other segments of the grape industry: raisins, juice, and table grapes. How is grape production affected by climate change? Climate change is very concerning for the wine and grape industry. The most important factor is that it brings a lot of climate variability into the practice of growing grapes and making wines. So for example, in 2023, worldwide, we hit a 60-year low in terms of the volume of wine produced. And that was particularly because of climate change. There are wildfires, there are floods, there's hail. For example, in Italy alone that year, in the south was a significant drought and heat wave where they reached 45 degrees Celsius in Sicily. And up in the north, they had huge storms that brought hail to many regions. All of this reduces the volume of wine that is produced. And grape growers need to figure out how to be working with this really variable climate where we're going to get more hail, more significant precipitation events, more frost, and more heat and drought in some cases as well. One thing that climate change is doing is it is opening up some new regions to viticulture. So for example, the United Kingdom was never a significant grape producer. They are producing now a fair amount of sparkling wine down in the southern part of England. A lot of new regions are going to be opening up as the weather changes, and we're going to be losing some of our warmer wine regions as well. How does climate change affect wines? It depends on the region where the grapes are being grown. When we think of things like increased heat and significant drought, then we tend to get higher sugar production in the grapes. The acidity is degraded, and the flavors and the aromas are impacted as well. So the wines can be very different based on this variable climate. There needs to be a change of practices for the industry. For example, in California, they're doing some great research about the possibility of using sunshades in vineyards to actually protect the vine and the fruit from excessive heat. Another option is moving to new varieties. So we know some of the standard varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon, Riesling, that are commonly grown in the United States and around the world as well, and moving to new varieties in some of these areas. So Grenache, Malbec, these are grapes that do really well in regions that are hot and reasonably dry. They still produce very deep, dark wines that are of interest to consumers. Another option is moving the location of vineyards, so planting at higher elevations where it's a little bit cooler, or opening up new wine regions. And a great example of that is the United Kingdom, where they've started growing sparkling wine grapes. What does climate change mean for the availability of wine? Climate change means that the total wine availability can fluctuate considerably more than it has in the past. So if we look at worldwide production, we see significant fluctuation now in terms of the volume of wine produced. And that can be directly attributed to climate change. So to wildfires in the West, to frosts, to drought, to heat waves, that all affects the quantity of grapes that are produced. So in many cases, we're seeing lower yields when we have those variable weather events, and that means lower wine production as well. How can vineyards and wineries become more resilient in the face of climate change? There are some adaptations that grape growers can make to contribute more resilience to their vineyards. One example would be a change in row orientation. So if changing the design of the vineyard so that the fruiting zone doesn't intercept as much light and the fruit is actually cooler than it was in a previous row orientation. Another example might be adopting a new rootstock in a region. So we always grow wine grapes on rootstocks for resiliency in terms of pests, but some of those rootstocks are actually better in drought conditions and can access more water and nutrients from the dry soil. And then there are some adaptations in the vineyard such as shade cloth that can help protect the fruit from excessive heat, or actually hail netting that can protect the vine in significant hailstorms. So there are some adaptations that growers can make, but those adaptations cost money and can sometimes be difficult to do, and they need a long-term plan. How do farmers decide what varieties of grapes to plant? Farmers decide what varieties based on a number of factors. Mostly it's about pairing the cultivar to the site where the vineyard is located. So for example, we have cool climate cultivars, such as Riesling would be a great example. And we have some warm climate cultivars, such as Cabernet Sauvignon. So they consider the location of the vineyard and the weather. They'll also consider the market. So there might be a grape that would be an incredible fit for a vineyard, but if the market isn't going to accept that variety, then they won't grow that. A lot of the time it's custom about what's grown in the region. So if we think of the regions in Europe, they tend to have some very specific cultivars that they grow. For example, Burgundy grows Pinot Noir. Bordeaux grows Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot. So a lot of the time, the decision about a variety is based on history, but also based on analysis of the weather, analysis of the soil, and of the market factors around the vineyard. How do different ways of training grapevines affect the grapes? So there are different ways of growing grapes, and those training systems will have an impact on the leaf area to fruit ratio, the exposure of the fruit, and on the ability of the vine to take up water and nutrients based on the leaf area that is existing within the training system. So that's all to say that when we change the training system, so for example, from a traditional vertically shoot position system to a high cordon, we're changing the leaf area, and that's going to have an impact on the water uptake by the vine. The fruit is going to be more or less shaded, and there's going to be a different amount of leaf area to be photosynthesizing and producing the carbon compounds that are important in terms of ripening the fruit. So training system can have a huge impact on the wine composition. What are some of the ways that technology helps farmers grow better grapes? The industry has been very interested in investigating new technologies that can be very helpful to them. So one example would be the advent of precision viticulture, which is using a significant number of data streams to help inform us about the variability that exists in a vineyard. One of those data streams is remote sensing. And so we can use satellites, or we can use what we call proximal sensing, which is sensors right on the tractor, that gives us indications about, for example, the health of the vine through something called normalized difference vegetation index. And we can make some decisions around management of the vine based on those. We've been seeing artificial intelligence starting to play more of a role in vineyard technologies. A great example would be AI-driven irrigation systems that are designed to give the vine what it needs, but also save as much water as possible. Another example of technology in the vineyard is robots. There are robots that can mow, there are robots that can help a grower prune, and there are robots that can do considerable data collection. So there's a lot of interesting technology out there that is going to help growers become more environmentally and economically sustainable. How does the soil in a vineyard affect the taste of the wine? This is an interesting question because there's a significant misconception out there with wine consumers that rocks in the soil results in a mineral taste in the wine. And in fact, that's not true. The soil mediates the water and the nutrients that the vine takes up. So if we have a soil that's very high in organic matter, it will hold a lot of water, it contains a lot of nutrients, and that will help the vine grow, and that will affect some of the things like the leaf area to fruit ratio and the exposure of the fruit to sunlight. If a soil is very low in organic matter, then the vine will have less water and less nutrients to take up, and that will significantly affect the growth of the vine, and that will change the composition of the wine too. But there isn't a soil that is better or worse. It's about how the soil affects the decisions that the grower makes in terms of their viticultural practices. What does sustainable farming mean for vineyards? Sustainable farming is difficult to define because it isn't a term that has specific regulations around it. So vineyards can define sustainable farming in their own way, and that definition will change based on the vineyard, based on the region, based on the country. So what I would consider sustainable farming is adoption of practices that reduce the impact of grape growing on the environment. So a couple of great examples would be using a cover crop in the vineyard. If a vineyard has bare soil, then that soil is more likely to erode from the wind or from water running through the vineyard. But if a cover crop is grown, then that protects the soil from erosion. Other sustainable practices might be the choice of fungicides or biofungicides, for example, is making choices there that are less impactful for the environment, and a reduction or elimination of herbicides as well. There's some newer practices that people are now adopting that are actually going back to older practices. And a great example is grazing of animals in vineyards. Now this is only for wine grape vineyards because we would never risk the bacterial possibilities in table grape vineyards. But in wine grape vineyards, because there's a fermentation step that kills the bacteria, some people are starting to adopt grazing practices and bringing back natural fertilization for vines. So the definition of sustainability depends significantly based on the grower and where the vineyard is located. What are some of the ways that vineyards can use less water? Well, one of the main things that growers are doing in drier regions is something called regulated deficit irrigation. And what it means is that at some stages of the vine growth, they cut significantly back on the water that they're giving the vine and using less water than total. And the impacts on the wines have been very positive. There are some other ways of reducing the amount of water, particularly when we're planting a vineyard. We could choose a rootstock that is going to root more deeply and have access to water, and also use a cultivar or a variety, for example, Grenache, that would be acceptable for using less water in the vineyard as well. Vineyards are working very hard to reduce the amount of water that they're using, particularly in the hot regions. Can you tell us about the Viticulture Enology major at Cornell? Our Viticulture Enology major started in 2008, and it's a science-based curriculum that allows for hands-on learning. So our students are focused in biology, chemistry, and plant sciences, but we also have applied courses such as winemaking, vineyard management, and some that are in between, like the flavor and aroma development of wine grapes. The hands-on learning occurs in our vineyards. We have two different vineyard sites, one in Ithaca, where we can grow our more cold hardy grapes, and one in Lansing, New York, where we can grow our classic European wine grapes. So we have a teaching vineyard there where we grow Riesling, Chardonnay, Cabernet Franc. And the students work there and they prune the vines and help manage the vines. We have a winery for the students to be working at in Stocking Hall, and this isn't a commercial winery. The tanks are quite small, and we do it that way so that the students get experience experimenting with different ways of doing things. So for winemaking, they might make multiple tanks and use different yeasts, for example. So we have temperature-controlled tanks, we have a bottling line, we have a large lab where the students analyze the juice that comes in and their fermentations. And so the students really get a lot of hands-on learning while they're with us, and then they go off and do an internship, either nationally or sometimes even internationally, where they get that experience of working in a vineyard and in a winery so that they understand how our science-based curriculum really applies out in the real world. What careers do graduates of viticulture and enology pursue? Our students have pursued a wide range of careers. Some of them are in vineyards, some of them are in wineries, but they also work in wine distribution, wine education, and writing. Because we have a science-based curriculum, they're able to actually use our major as a launch pad into some of the other careers they may be interested in that aren't particularly related to viticulture and enology, but need an undergraduate in science. Many of our students have gone on to graduate school, for example, and are pursuing different avenues that way. How can students study wine and grapes if they're underage? Well, any student can study wine and grapes, but what's somewhat unique to Cornell is that our students are allowed to taste small amounts of wines starting from the beginning of their program, because there's an exemption in New York State alcohol laws that allows students to do this if a faculty member is present, if they're enrolled in a course for credit, and if they are not consuming but are in fact spitting out the wine. And we believe that wine tasting is really an essential part of a wine education. It would be very difficult to train students to be winemakers without actually having them taste wine until their senior year, or in some cases, even later.